All right, let's talk now about supply and quantity supplied, which is very similar to the concept of demand and quantity demanded. And we begin with the law of supply. And the law of supply states that there is a positive relationship between price and quantity supplied. So when you can get a higher price, you obviously feel more encouraged to produce more. But a closer look at the supply function reveals that the supply function essentially captures the marginal cost of production. The idea is to say every extra unit that you want to produce causes higher cost, at least after a special amount that you have already produced. So every extra unit that you produce causes you higher extra cost. So in order to feel encouraged to produce another unit, you also need to face a higher price. So when we said earlier that the demand function captures people's marginal utility, and that utility is subject to the law of diminishing marginal utility, from which we derived the negative slope of the demand function. Likewise, when it comes to supply, we have the law of supply, and the supply curve is subject to the law of increasing marginal opportunity cost. And at least this is true after some point of production. So when you produce more and more units, especially after you have already exhausted things like specialization gains, then as soon as extra units of production cause you higher costs, you also need to have higher prices in order to make up for those. So that's the reason behind the increasing supply curve. And again, we have a supply curve and an inverse supply curve because we put also for the supply the price at the y-axis and quantity demanded on the x-axis. So the supply function is also a function of price, but we typically write it inversely, where we have the price then to the left side of the equation, and we'll do an example soon. But let's just quickly take a look again at this specific supply function that you see here. So it's this one here. Let's make it a little bit bigger. And let's also okay, so if the price is 9, then quantity supplied would be 7. If the price is 6, quantity supplied would be 4, and at a price of 3, quantity supplied would be 1. So the supply curve captures again an individual's willingness to sell at a certain price, and it is also called, this price is also known the seller's reservation price. So for example, a quantity of 1 would only be produced if the seller could get at least 3. Well, of course, the seller would like to get 4, 5, 6, or 7, or 10, but that's the reservation price. The price cannot go below. So the supply function captures the reservation price, and that reservation price in turn is a function of the marginal opportunity cost. Okay, so now let's take a look at some specific supply functions. So we can see here, so it says draw the two supply function. So one is Q equals negative 2 plus P. And of course, if P goes up, Q goes up. So that captures the positive relationship. But when we draw it like this, we don't really want to look at a function where Q is to the left side of the equation, and we would expect the price to be to the left side of the equation. So now let's convert again this supply function into the inverse supply function. So we want to isolate the price, and then I can just add on both sides plus 2, and then I get P equals 2 plus Q. So that would be the inverse supply function to the supply function Q equals negative 2 plus P. So that would be this function here. Okay, what about the next one? Q equals negative 8 plus 2P. So let's isolate again the price. So then we can write 2P equals 8 plus Q. So I added plus 8 on both sides, and then we divide by 2, and then we get P equals 4 plus 0.5 Q. So that would be then the second function. So again, and here P equals 2 plus Q, that corresponds to Q equals negative 2 plus P, and the inverse demand function P equals 4 plus 0.5 Q corresponds to the demand function Q equals negative 8 plus 2P. Okay, so when we talked about the demand, we said there are shifters of demand, and there are also shifters of supply. And again, just to review again, a change in quantity supplied means a movement along the supply curve. So this one is a change in quantity supplied. So if we move along a given supply schedule, and a change in demand would be something like this. A shift to the right, that's an increase in supply, or a shift to the left, that's a decrease in supply. And so what are those determinants? So they are first production costs, and then again also expectations. We can also think of prices of related products. Very important, the number of sellers and competition, and taxes and subsidies. So let's start with the production cost. And so let's say this is our supply function. And now what happens is that, let's say the oil price goes up, and the oil price is an important factor in production. So if oil prices go up, typically energy prices go up, everything else goes up. So now we can say that those higher prices either shift the demand function up, but that would be the same as to say, it shifts the supply function to the left. So it either shifts the supply function up or to the left. Both is a decrease in supply. So when production costs go up, the supply decreases. So some people may say that at every given quantity produced, the higher production costs are now being tried to be rolled over to the consumers. So that is why we will say the supply curve shifts up. But in most textbooks it says that when production costs go up, it is a decrease in supply. So that means at every given price and every given quantity, if suddenly prices go up, then I cannot produce as much with my total revenue. So let's say that the price is currently 5. So let's quickly identify that point. So let's say we are currently here. So now what happens is that at the price of 5, so when price is 5, the quantity supplied is 3. And then the total revenue is price times quantity is 15. So let's say this is my total revenue. If now at this total revenue 15, the production costs go up and I have to pay more for my raw materials or energy sources, then with my given budget of 15, I can only produce much less. And that will explain why there's a shift to the left. But you can also say higher prices at every given quantity are being tried to roll over to the consumers. That would be an upward shift. But if you argue that at any given price and any given and the corresponding total revenue, when then prices go up, well, it can only produce less and supply shifts to the left. Okay, so the point is when production costs go up, supply decreases. Okay, let's talk next about expectations and preferences. And assume that people develop a greater preference for electric car, which pushes up prices for electric cars, while holding constant the prices for combustion engine cars. And then as a result, quantity supplied for electric cars increases. That's a movement along the supply curve. But the supply of combustion engine driven cars shifts to the left. Okay, so let's draw that and make it simpler. So we have two markets. So here we put the price and here we have the quantity. So we have the supply for electric vehicles, EVs. And we have a supply function. And we have a market for combustion engine. Just combustion, and there's also supply function. Okay, so now let's say there is more demand for EVs. So initially the demand was here, and then this was our initial equilibrium. But now when the demand shifts to the right, because EVs become more popular, then what happens is that we move from this point to that point. And that is an increase in quantity supplied. So we move along the supply curve from the first red dot to the second. So we move from from 1 to 2. And that's an increase in quantity supplied. So now let's say a company that produces EVs, that uses up more of its machines and resources to produce EVs, That means those resources cannot be available to make combustion engines. So no matter what the price for combustion engines is, let's say the price is P bar, and this is our price for combustion engines, then because we use up more resources of our given resources, and we have the same resources to produce EVs at any given price, we will now produce less combustion engine vehicles. So in this case we have a shift from, let's say, 1 to 2. Okay, so what happens is when preferences for EVs shift up the price for EVs, quantity supplied of EVs increases, but supply of combustion engine vehicles goes down. What about expectations? Assume consumers expect that in the future combustion engine cars will be taxed, therefore reducing demand and prices for combustion engine cars. As a result, quantity supplied of combustion engine cars will decrease, movement along the supply curve, but supply of electric cars shifts right. Let's also do that. So now we start with the combustion engine cars, and people expect that they are going to be taxed. Okay, so now here we have the combustion engine. Okay. So consumers expected in the future combustion engine cars will be taxed, therefore reducing demand. So now we basically start with our demand function. So this was our original equilibrium, but now because of the tax fears, demand shifts to the left or decreases. So that's a decrease in demand. So now we move to this point. So that is a movement along the supply functions. It's a reduction in quantity supplied. But now for the electric vehicles, because the price has not changed, so the price stayed constant. So, but now, because the company uses up less of its workers and machines to build combustion engine cars, it will increase the supply of EVs, which is a right shift. Okay, so that's going to happen. So let's talk next about competition. That's pretty straightforward. So if we have more competition, and let's say we start with our initial supply function. So let's say this is our initial supply function. And now we have more competition. Maybe we sign a trade agreement with another country that allows their producers to compete domestically. Well, then this obviously shifts the supply curve to the right or down, no matter how you want to see it. So that means at every given price, if there's more competition, there will be, more people competing for the consumers. And you could also say at every given price, if there are more consumers, that will push down the prices. But the point is that an increase in competition shifts the supply curve either down or to the right, but what it has meant, it is an increase in supply. Likewise, if we sign trade agreements that keeps competitors out of our market, supply will shift to the left or up. Okay, let's talk next about taxes and supply. They are also very important determinants. So let's say we start with our supply function, which is here. And now let's say the government taxes the supply. So let's say you produce something which is considered to be bad, like, I don't know, tobacco or soda. So now if the government imposes a tax, that is basically a cost to the producers. So that follows now the same logic like an increase in the production cost. So you can now think that this either shifts the supply curve up or to the left. So the logic is the same as with higher production costs. And now let's make that a different color. So that would be the supply with a tax. So the producers, the suppliers, they try to roll over the higher tax. So let's say if the tax is 2, then mathematically the supply curve shifts up by 2, or it shifts down. And because again, if you, let's say, if the current price is 7 and the company sold 3, total revenue is 21, but now if they have to pay a tax on it, that means at this new total revenue, with the tax they can produce much less. Or they try to roll up or to roll over the higher price to the consumers. So supply to the tax, you can either shift it up or to the left, same thing. So the opposite of a tax is a subsidy. Let's say someone produces something which is considered to be a good thing, then this will shift the supply curve down. And let's give it a different color, maybe green. So that means if the price was 7 and the current quantity supplied was 3, then the total revenue would be 21. But now the government also gives the producer an additional subsidy of 2, and that for each unit. That means it's like a cost reduction that shifts the supply curve, that allows the suppliers to either produce more or to produce a given quantity at the lower cost. So if you get a subsidy with our given budget, now we get a subsidy, we can either produce more or at our given quantity we can produce much less, at a much lower cost. Both is a shift to the right. Okay, so the point is that tax shifts the supply curve to the left and a subsidy shifts it to the right. Or the tax shifts the supply curve up or to the left and a subsidy shifts it to the right or down. You can make a case for either one. Okay, so now the last aspect is again similar to what we did also in the demand. At some point we need to get from individual supply functions to the market supply function. And we do that again with horizontal aggregation. So here we have producer A, and producer A can produce certain amounts at lower cost, maybe So producer A can produce quantities between 0 and 1 with a reservation price between 2 and 4. So that is clearly the most efficient. Producer B and C, they can only start producing if they get at least 4. And in fact, producer C would require at least 6. So between a quantity between 0 and 1, only producer A can produce. So that means in the aggregate supply function, this section from producer A defines the market function. So now beginning at the price of 4 and all the way up to 6, it is A and B that supply. So at the price of 6, producer A's quantity supplied is 2, and let's also make that a little bit bigger so we can see it better. Make this orange. And at the price of 6, this is another 2. So that means at the price of 6, horizontally aggregated total market supply should be 4. So this is basically orange and red. And I don't know, I made that. Let's make it dark orange maybe. And then beginning from starting with the price of 6, all 3 producers will supply. So now we just can randomly select maybe the price of 8. So at price of 8, producers A quantity supplied is 3. At 8, B supplies 4. So 3 plus 4 is 7. And C produces 1, so that should be 8. So here, this is so that means at the price of 8, we should have a total quantity of 8, which means I have to make sure that at 8, I'm on 8, and then I can extend it if I want to. Okay, so this is how we get to the market supply function. So the market supply function is also the horizontal aggregation of individual supply functions. And again, individual supply functions captures producer's reservation price of the production of a certain producing a certain quantity, and that reservation price is again a reflection of the marginal cost of production, but that is something that we will talk about in more detail in later videos. For now, what is important is that you understand the law of demand, the law of supply, have an idea of the shifters of demand and supply, the determinants, and yeah, so that will be the foundation or the basis of what we do next, which is welfare analysis.